Have you ever been really excited about diving into your art? Maybe something new has inspired you. Motivation sits upon your doorstep, ready for you to get to work. And perhaps you do. Perhaps you dive into something new. The excitement carries you for a time, and then it fades. Weeks later, months later, perhaps even just days later, you look back and wonder, what happened? Why didn't I continue to work? Why wasn't I consistent? But consistency when it comes to art is difficult. Real life rears its ugly head sometimes and keeps us from doing the things that we want to do. It's hard to stick to something, especially when it becomes difficult. In this episode, we're going to be talking about consistency, why it's so important for us as artists perhaps, but mostly why it's so difficult to maintain. So let's start with this. What is consistency? It's a word that many of us feel as if we have a good definition for. In fact, when I went to look up a definition for this episode, I typed in consistency, and after getting a whole bunch of definitions that had to do with the physical texture of a thing, I went with consistent instead. And our good friend Merriam-Webster defines it as this: marked by harmony, regularity, or steady continuity, free from variation or contradiction. So, to be consistent is to stick to something, to do something repetitiously, to do something at the same time or with the same level of regularity. But why is this important? As with any skill, you put in time in order to learn something new. You have to practice. You have to hone skills. It might take some time to wrap your head around how perspective works, for example, and it's going to take hours of practice for you to do so. But, as with all other skills, if you don't put those skills into practice frequently enough, you will begin to forget things. You will become less proficient. In fact, in many cases, if you lack consistency with your practice, you won't achieve much of anything ever. And that is such a tragic notion. Consistency here is less about holding yourself to a standard and more about holding on to what you have already claimed. It's hard to learn how to draw or paint or write, and so it only makes sense to protect what you have gained already. There are few things more frustrating than walking back up to your easel after a long stretch apart, only to realize you don't know what you're doing anymore. You don't remember how to start a piece. You don't remember the way that you like to start a piece. And you certainly can't mix the specific green that you need. That might be one of the most frustrating things that you can encounter as an artist. Stepping back into your work after life or patience or stress has pulled you away from it, and you find that you're no longer capable of doing the things that you once were. So consistency is necessary mostly because it prevents backsliding. It prevents time from leeching away your skills. But it also allows for the building of those skills in the first place and for the continual development of new ones. As we begin to move forward, this is how I'm going to break down the topic of this episode. I want to first look at why you aren't consistent now. Then follow that up with the philosophical components of consistency, like motivation and desire. And finally, I will spend some time talking about practical strategies and little changes that you can make to hopefully engage with your art more consistently. If only one or two of these appeal to you, please check out the timestamps in the description below, and feel free to skip ahead to part 2 or 3 if you would like. Alright, let's dive in. So why aren't you consistent now? Consistency, first of all, is hard. And while it does come more naturally for some people, I've found over the years that it's difficult for most of us. Many of us have found our way into consistency by accident, or with some struggle over the years. I think one of the best places to start, though, is looking into the why behind the lack of consistency. After all, if it's something you desire, there is likely some inhibition or some barrier that's keeping it at arm's reach. So analyze why you don't want to do the work you want to do. Let's take a look at some common causes for this. And of course, there are going to be more, so as I'm listing, if anything occurs to you that I don't have here, please share in the comments below. I think the most obvious and probably the most constant culprit is time. Time is a very common barrier. In fact, probably the most common that we run into. It takes many different forms, and each have slightly different ways of popping up or being handled. So let's go over some of them quickly. You don't have the time. This might be simply that your life is incredibly busy. Maybe you are a mother or father of several children and you have to work 2 jobs just to make ends meet. Or maybe you're a student who is working on your medical degree and you're putting in 80 hours a week. There are plenty of scenarios that are not irrational and involve no laziness that basically lead to you having no extra time. And sometimes the limited time you have has to be spent just watching something or playing a few minutes of a video game because you have to recuperate. And that's rational. We as humans need time to just get back to our homeostasis. So this might be the case for you, that you simply don't have time in your schedule, and it's very, very difficult to block out any amount in order to work on your artwork. Perhaps when you have time, you don't know what to do. This is unfortunate and happens quite often, oddly. It seems a pretty common thing for artists to sit down to get excited about the executing of something, the drawing of something, and then by the time you get all your supplies together, you don't know what to do. This is perhaps easier to solve than the prior issue, but it's not particularly uncommon and can be really motivation sapping when you finally sit down and you find out that there's no inspiration and you just don't know what to do. Sometimes it's a lack of prep. You finally have 10 or 15 minutes to work on your drawing and you don't know where your sketchbook is. Maybe you're a painter and you didn't clean your palette last time, and so instead of getting to paint for 10 or 15 minutes, you have to go clean things. Maybe you don't remember where your resources are, your references. This can sometimes have to do specifically with supplies or with the space, but this is an easy problem to run into. If you don't have a lot of extra time, it's sometimes really difficult to put in those extra couple minutes when you finish a session and get things cleaned, get things put away. And especially if you have kids running around or you've got some roommates that mess with your stuff, sometimes it's just difficult to find your supplies. Sometimes it's about not knowing when you'll have time. Maybe you work a job where you're on call. Maybe you work a job where the days off come randomly. I did snow removal for a time. I did landscaping, and then the winter version of that was snow removal. And that made scheduling really odd because if we had a generally normal weather day, I would go into work and do things. I would go water plants in the middle of winter. But then if we got a snowstorm, it might be working 10 or 13 or 14 hours in a single day, followed by 2 or 3 days of no work. And for me, it was really difficult in the not knowing when I was going to have work, when I was going to have free time. Art, for some people, where it's mostly joy, is easier to shove into those little blocks of time. But when you really like to work on large projects or you're honing a skill specifically, not knowing how much time you're going to have to do something can be a little bit anxiety inducing. And sometimes time comes in big chunks instead of smaller, consistent chunks. And this can be hampering as well. Maybe you are in a particular profession or a lifestyle where you might not have any time to work on art for several months, and then all of a sudden you have 2 weeks with no obligations, where you could conceptually just sit down and work on art for those 2 weeks. But if that's the case, that's not particularly consistent. And that can put you in a position where you're running into that regrettable situation of realizing you've lost skills. There's little consistency to be found when there's little consistency in your schedule. But outside of time, maybe you don't like the kind of work you're doing. The kind of work you do isn't exciting or fun to engage in. This might be because you're dedicating too much time to practice. So sometimes, even when you have time available, you have the ability to build habits and consistency, but when you sit down to actually spend the time making art, it's not rewarding. This is a little bit strange, I expect, for some of you to hear, but there's a lot of us who feel like we have to develop a certain set of skills before we can do the things that we want to do artistically. So we spend hours upon hours studying animals, studying anatomy, working on perspective, things perhaps that we don't necessarily enjoy, but we are investing time into them because we anticipate that it will render joy later. It could be that you're in the middle of a large project and it's just not fun anymore. I do this often. I get halfway through finishing a painting generally, and often I just get pulled aside because of something else. Maybe it's time to go to sleep. Maybe I have to run to work or the gallery or go pick up my daughter from school or something. And then when I come back to it, it's just not that exciting. And so it sits on my easel for a while in embarrassment and shame. And then eventually I move it off the easel and start another piece. And there's a 20% chance that I just don't finish that piece either. So it's hard sometimes. Sometimes the work that you're doing is just not something you're excited about. This could be even more so if you're taking classes, if you're in school, because then you have very little control over what the project is and what you're doing. But in this particular scenario, you have control over the work that you're doing. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of advice will tell you, even if you're studying, if you're trying to become way better at making art, that at least half of your artistic time needs to be put into things that you enjoy. And I think that's really sound advice. So even if you are working on anatomy or perspective or landscape or painting technique, make sure that you take some time to just do things that bring you joy. Maybe it's the fact that you don't like your current results. And this is different from the prior one. Maybe you finish pieces frequently, you even enjoy working on them, and then you look at them afterwards and you're just disappointed. Disappointment comes frequently for us as artists because we have such high expectations. We often are driven by excitement and inspiration at the beginning of a project, and by the time we finish it, that stuff is usually dissipated, and we're often susceptible to disappointment at that moment. And this is just part of being a creator. It's good to take note when you finish a thing and you're excited about it, and you share it with somebody else perhaps, or maybe you simply write yourself a note, reminding yourself that this was a good piece that you were happy with in that moment. And this is something I'll touch upon later as well, but I just want to throw it in here too. It's good to remember that your art changes over time, just like you change over time. And a piece that you were happy with a week ago that you aren't happy with now was still a piece that you were happy with a week ago, and try to hold on to some of that. Maybe you have no motivation or inspiration. These are actually fairly different things, though we use them interchangeably a lot. Inspiration is that spark of excitement that makes you want to get involved in something, whereas motivation is the push to actually do the thing. I find frequently that I'm motivated to make art and I'm not inspired to make art. I sit down and I'm like, I need to make things and I'm gonna make stuff, but I'm not really inspired. Sometimes this is the case with the stuff that I do for instructional content here on the channel. I'm not necessarily inspired to go draw a rock or work on my cross-hatching techniques. What I'm inspired to do is to help other people. And I'm motivated in that aspect because it's a good thing to do. Motivation is far stronger when it's intrinsic, when it comes from you. Inspiration is fickle, but I would also say that motivation tends to be fickle, especially if you lean on it, if you depend on it to get anything done. So inspiration is perhaps easier to solve if you're missing out on inspiration. It's easy to go find other artists who are working on cool things, travel around the area in which you live, find things that inspire you and are exciting, and try to figure out how to get them into your art. If you find yourself toppling over that edge where you're looking at lots of other artists' work and you feel like you don't stack up to them, like your work will never be as good as them, you've gone over a precipice and you need to pull yourself back, or at the very least, you need to stop engaging. Scrolling on Instagram can be super inspiring, and yet it can also be incredibly damaging. And sometimes it can be worse than either one of those and just pull you out of the game because you just sit there and observe and you don't actually create. So be careful about it. I like how Mark Burnett actually talks about this. He talks about the fact that you should allocate time every day that you're working on art to do some research, to find cool things. And I think this is a really good piece of advice. Spend some time before you get into a drawing or after you're done with a drawing looking at cool drawings. It's easy to be inspired by other people and their work and the stuff that happens around you. And fortunately, though I think the internet in a lot of ways is pretty damaging, but one of the fortunate things is you're able to listen to this right now, and we're all able to go see what artists all around the world are producing. And that's a pretty magical, pretty cool thing. Maybe you have no space. Maybe simply your living situation is rather tough. You've got a tiny room, maybe you're young and you still live at home, and so you just don't have any space in that room. Maybe you live in a small apartment. You share it with a couple other people, maybe some of your kids, and it's just really hard to carve out a chunk of space. This is pretty common and really difficult. I am fortunate right now. I have a small room in our basement that is dedicated to my art and video production. It's smaller than any of the other rooms in the house, and I'm still very, very thankful to have it because I have a place where things can permanently stay set up. You might be fortunate where you've got more space, or you can take over the kitchen counter or a dining room table or something. And maybe you have less space and you just need to clean off one part of your desk in your room, or even just a nightstand next to your bed. I would encourage you though, whatever space you do have, utilize it. If all you have is a corner of your room, just make sure that that's set up with your art supplies and it's easy to get to. Things don't get lost. But space concerns are real. There have been many years where I didn't work on painting because I just didn't have a good place to paint. I didn't have an easel for a long time. I've only ever owned one easel, actually. But it spent a long time in storage, either in the barn or in the garage, just because it needed to be cleaned, and I'm not going to go buy a new one. I'm pretty frugal, pretty cheap. But now I have it set up in here, and I have a good space to work on it. And if you haven't tried painting on an easel, by the way, if you're a painter, it is very different than painting flat. I really enjoy it. There's different things about how your wrist moves, but space is a real concern. If you don't have it, it's really detrimental. If you have any, I would just encourage you to utilize it and make sure that that space is reserved for your artwork. Maybe it's a critique thing. Maybe you critique your art too much. Maybe you get critique from other people around you. And maybe you're afraid of being embarrassed of your artwork. This, unfortunately, happens pretty frequently because other people have a tendency to comment on our artwork when it's not asked for. It's part of the reason why in our Discord server, I made sure that I have a channel there where there's a channel for no feedback. Like, I'm just posting a thing. I do not want feedback on this. And then there's varying levels of critique that you can get where people can be pretty harsh, not being unkind, but they can just strip away the niceties and give you feedback that is straight to the point. The nose is wrong because of these 3 things. The ear is wrong because of these 3 things. But there's varying levels of that where you can get really light feedback, or you can just show what you're working on at this point in time. It's really important that we as artists, and especially if you're older, that we are kind to the younger artists, because it's crazy, but a single stray word can sometimes just dismantle a young artist's confidence in themselves. I would encourage you, because I think for most of us, we have a moment like this, that something's happened, that an art teacher, a parent, an uncle, a sibling said something about our artwork at one point, and all of a sudden our hopes and dreams were dashed. And we felt like, this is stupid, I shouldn't be putting time into this, I'm a bad artist, this is worthless, yada, yada, yada. And it's just not true. So we need to be careful with our words, but it's also really understandable if you are a person who's encountered this. You've run into a situation where you have the time to work on your art. Maybe you have the space, but you're scared to work on it because you've gotten some nasty feedback, some nasty critique in the past. And if that's you, I am sorry. And I would encourage you to be vulnerable again. But just be vulnerable with people you can trust. And maybe with weird strangers on the internet on our Discord server, because it's a pretty kind little community. And if you want to check it out, it's linked in the description below. Maybe it's burnout. Maybe burnout's keeping you from working on things. And unfortunately, this can often represent itself pretty similarly to a lack of motivation and inspiration. And in fact, the two might be synonymous for you. You get to this point in your day where you've decided to sit down and work on your art, and nope, can't do anything. And this might be that you're just burnt out in other areas of life, or maybe you're burnt out creatively. You need to take some time and recalibrate things to reignite that pilot light. You need to put some more time into you and valuing yourself and being gracious with yourself before you try to dive back into your artwork. Burnout is real, and especially in our culture today, it seems to be occurring a little bit more frequently. Maybe it's just the fact that you have unclear goals. You're overwhelmed with the amount of decisions that you need to make. Sometimes this will present itself as you sit down and you don't know what to work on. But in this case, it's often going to be you've got too many things you want to work on. And this can happen because you don't really have a defined goal. You don't know where you're trying to go with your artwork. And so therefore, it's very, very difficult to sit down and get a consistent art practice because you don't really know where you're aiming. So obviously, the antidote for this is going to be to hone in on what your desires are, to make sure that you have a concrete focus. We're obviously going to expand upon that in the future here. That said, let's go ahead and slide into part 2, which is the philosophical and psychological components of consistency. The first thing that I want to chew on here is probably something that you're going to have to spend some time outside of this podcast thinking about. And that's, why do you want to do the work in the first place? This might seem pretty simple or maybe even redundant. However, I find that often our issues are tethered to very simple things. So why do you want to do the work? This isn't even really about goals or plans or dreams, it's just a matter of why. I draw because creating makes me happy, because I feel the urge to make things, because a clever little drawing cracks me up and makes me enjoy life just a little bit more. I write and world build because I have to. Because if I don't, I decay a little bit more each day. I have a need and urge to make and create. And if I don't engage with it, my life is worse. But what about you? What do you do? And why do you want to? Why do you want to do the work? Why do you want to be consistent with your art practice? Is it for a great dream and you have to be consistent to get there? Or is it because it's self-care? Because it's good for you to do the artwork, and therefore it's taking care of yourself. And these two are not the only options. Goodness no, there are so many options. But it's good, perhaps essential, to analyze, to understand yourself, to figure out what drives you and where your desires come from. Spend some time here if you don't get an answer right away. Think about why you want to do the work. For some, this will be a very simple question, maybe one that requires less than a moment of hesitation. But if that is not you, if you hesitate even a few seconds, I would urge you to take a walk and to think about it. Lay on the couch without your phone and just think. Why do you want to do the work? Then, when you've thought it through, when you've chewed on it, think about where that leads you. Will it make you consistent in and of itself? No, but it will give you the pieces you lack right now in order to start moving forward. And as you do move forward, as you commit to consistency, be aware of the fact that there is some innate stress in committing to something. For some people, it's the dabbling that is joyful, that is stressless. And when you commit to showing up every day, to try to draw every single day of the week, to take on a challenge like Smogust or Inktober, that commitment feels like you're trapped. It feels like you're limited. This is a very understandable human thing, but if you don't know this about yourself, you can find that you get involved in something and then you stagnate and you walk away and you look back months later and go, what happened? Why did I fade away from this? Why didn't I put more time into it? So you can spend some time thinking about this. Is there some stress for you as a person because you've committed to something? And work backward from there. Commitment is often a scary thing for people. Not for everyone, but if this is you, try to take that apart. You are deciding on what you want to be consistent with. You are deciding what you want to commit to, and you have the power to make that decision. You have the power to revamp that decision later if you've decided on something different, if this is not the way that you want to continue moving forward. And maybe sometimes just that realization can help you. If you realize you're not stuck, you're not trapped, you've created a cage for yourself, but you have the keys. And maybe it's not a cage, maybe it's a couch, maybe it's a nice bench in the middle of a forest. You have the power to decide how this works. So if you feel some innate stress from committing to things, just try to dismantle that. And sometimes that entire thing can happen because of expectations. Sometimes you heap up these expectations for yourself, and inevitably they twist themselves and warp themselves into the bars that become our cages. Because expectations can hold you hostage. So try thinking about if your expectations for yourself are rational. If you're a beginner and you're trying to figure things out really quickly and have a really tangible result by the end of the year, for example, that might not be rational. You might not be able to master anatomy in 3 months. You might not be able to figure out perspective in a weekend. Make sure that your expectations for yourself are rational, or maybe just tempered. Whatever you would normally come up with, try to think about if someone else in your life who you loved had that same expectation. Would you look at them and be like, I don't think you should hold yourself to that. That seems a little harsh. Often we treat other people better than we treat ourselves. So sometimes that's a good lens to look at things through. Think about other artists in your life. Would you give them the same advice that you're giving to yourself? Would you consider it wise for them to hold themselves to the same level of expectation that you're holding yourself to? Think about that. Imbibe of it. And if it really is pretty discordant, consider changing it. Is your perspective focused on the whole picture or just on individual elements? Oddly, both of these are fine. It's just a matter of accurately understanding which you are focusing on. If you have a tendency to focus on individual components of your artwork or individual skills that you're practicing, and then hold yourself to the finished product as an expectation, that can be really bad for your self-esteem and for your motivation. If you likewise are focusing entirely on the products, like the large-scale projects that you're working on, and then you get to the end and are not evaluating the entirety of the piece, but you're really nitpicking yourself on individual things, that can also be really detrimental for your forward momentum. And again, neither of these is wrong. It's just a matter of having an understanding of what way you're leaning toward, having an understanding of who you are as an artist and how you interpret things. Now, this last section is actually going to start blending in between the kind of philosophical and psychological components and actual strategies, because I don't think it's beneficial to talk about all these things in just a ranting, diegetic kind of explanation. I think it's beneficial to actually talk about what we can do, because we do have some level of control here. We can't control everything, obviously, but it's generally better to focus on the things we can control. And the first of these that I want to focus on, which does kind of bridge this gap, it's a real thing that we can do, but it's also kind of esoteric, is thinking about goals and plans. From the philosophical side of things, goals and plans are really important. They allow you to think about what you are doing, why you are doing it, and constantly realign yourself as need be. But they are fundamentally philosophical. Your goals for yourself as an artist are not tangible things generally, unless it's literally the goal of like, I want to finish a book or I want to make a comic book. But generally our goals are loose, like improve, get better, express myself more. And those things are totally fine. But if they don't exist, well, I would argue that they always exist. But if you don't know them, if you think they don't exist because you haven't spent time analyzing yourself, thinking about how you work as an artist, If you haven't spent time thinking about them recently or putting them down on some kind of page or in the, under the front cover of your sketchbook, they can be elusive. And the thing is that your goals and plans can be a constant friend that guides you down the path. And path it is. It is a long journey to become the artist that you want to be. And none of our journeys are the same because the artist that you want to be is not the artist that I want to be. We probably have some destinations and maybe some roads even that will overlap in that journey, but we are not the same person. We are doing different things, and that's how it should be. So think about your goals and plans. And this is one of those steps where if you have goals and plans and you just don't spend much time thinking about them, write them down. Just open a Google Doc or a note on your phone and just title it and just brain dump anything that comes up, anything exciting that you might want to do someday with your art, just list it and see how that unfolds. Now, if you haven't done a lot of planning or goal setting in the past, I'm going to touch upon that briefly in the next segment of this, but also I have some videos on that and I'll leave them in the description down below because I do have some videos where I really think about and pull apart how you can set goals for yourself in the long term. But all of that said, let's go ahead and move into part 3. This is where we're going to actually talk about some specific strategies, things that you can actually do in order to help yourself establish a more consistent art practice. I want to start with the fact that there is no quick fix. Generally, when you're doing this, you're trying to build a habit, and habits take time. It's part of the good part of them and part of the bad part of them. If you've ever tried to break a bad habit, you know it takes a lot of time. You have to be really consistent to do that. Likewise, a lot of the other things we do in life are habits. They're just things that we haven't thought about. If you make coffee every single morning, it's a habit. For the first couple weeks, you probably had to think about it, and now you don't. Your drive to work is a habit. Your ride on the train or however it is that you get to wherever you go every day is a habit. For a time, it took mental processes. You had to think about it. And then after a certain amount of time had elapsed, it was just second nature. It was a habit. So the first thing that I want to deal with here is the lack of time that came up earlier. When you have no time to work on art, there's really nothing you can do. And I suppose my advice there would be a little bit different than what the rest of it would be, which is if you have a lifestyle that gives you no free time, then you are in a difficult position. If this is what you have to do to put food on the table for yourself or your family, that just might be your lot for the time being. And if that is the case, I am very sorry because that is a very, very difficult way to live your life. I have been there for very small stints of my life, but I've had a lot of friends and I've had some of my friends' parents growing up who worked 2 or even 3 jobs because that's just what was necessary to put food on the table. If that is you, then way to go, because that is a very, very hard way to live, and you have my praise for doing what is necessary. The second piece of this advice is if that's not actually necessary, or if you've been at it for a long time, I would take measures to work yourself away from that. The periods in my life where I have been just filled to the brim with things to do, where I've had no time to play a video game, no time to read a book, no time to just sit and stare at a wall and watch paint dry if I want. Those have been the hardest parts of my life. We don't always have the ability to shift everything, but if this is you, I would encourage you to try slowly over time to make some changes. And maybe art's not the first thing that you pull into your life. Maybe it is, maybe that's what you need, but it might even just be some time once a week to sit down and watch a TV show. You are human and you need a break now and again. So try to do whatever you can slowly over time to work toward that. However, most people are going to be in this next category, which is going to be you have limited time or you have really random time. And there are some things that you can do to utilize that well. If you have very limited time, you can try to structure habits that allow you to just work really consistently, maybe just 5 minutes a day, but you can just dedicate yourself to that and build that habit over time. We'll talk a little bit more about habits in a bit, but the big thing here is Have stuff prepped and planned. Make sure if you use reference materials that you have them. They are already allocated. When you have a few minutes at work, just find some cool photos and save them. Save things you find on Instagram that inspire you. Keep track of your materials. Don't lose them. Make sure that they're stored. Clean up at the end of things. Make sure that you are ready when the time strikes. If you only have a few minutes, maybe you have a baby and whenever they go down for a nap, you have just a couple minutes. Make sure that things are always ready for you to dive in so you can utilize that time whenever it jumps out. But the biggest thing here, starting this section proper, I suppose, is make the point of entry as easy as possible. Get rid of anything that makes it difficult to start. And that's really what all of these following things are going to fit into, other than just building habits. We have a tendency to put up barriers, and barriers have a tendency to arise just out of the state of the universe. So whatever you can do to dismantle something that makes it difficult for you to get into your artwork, you should do that. And you'll notice that that's what a lot of these things were. Like, oh, you don't have space. Like, that makes it harder. You don't have time. That makes it harder. You didn't clean up your supplies. That makes it harder. You don't know where your supplies are. That makes it harder. So eliminate as many of those things as you can. Try to keep your space organized. Try to make sure that you have stuff prepped ahead of time. Maybe start things when you only have a few minutes and you can just dive into it later. Whatever you can do, the mindset here is to lower that barrier of entry. Make it as easy to dive into your artwork when you have the time as possible. Now, let's go ahead and talk about goals and plans a little bit from the more practical and strategic side of things. So, goals and plans are going to point you in the right direction, sure. But they're also often going to give you a list of things that you need to do, a group of checkboxes to fill out and ensure you are progressing and moving forward. And again, if you don't have solidly defined goals and plans, I would stop right here and go do that. Unless you're just working on the joy of the art or you're just getting involved for the first time. But even if that's the case, there's probably still some manner of goal you have in the back of your mind. Maybe one that you're embarrassed about and you need to, get over that and put it down on paper and realize that if your goal is to become the next Tolkien, that's totally fine. Is it probably going to happen? Probably not. But you know what? Somebody eventually will, and it could be you. You never know. You never know what's going to happen. And art is good to produce one way or the other. So start with goals. If you don't have any, again, like I mentioned earlier, I will link you to a video specifically on building goals for yourself and how you can do that in a rational way. But goals are important because they tell you where you're going. They let you know if each piece of work that you do is aligned with that, if it's taking you in that direction. Not that every single work needs to do that, but if you're working on things that bring you joy, you can kind of pseudo-align them with your goals. Goals allow you to evaluate progress. And the fact that you're making progress can often be really motivating in keeping you going forward. It's really hard to keep moving forward with anything if you feel like you're stagnating, that you're not making any progress. But goals, because they are a particular thing that you can gauge how close you are to meeting, you can actually evaluate how much progress you're making. For example, I have my second novel I'm working on right now, and it's totally outlined. I know approximately how many chapters there are going to be, and I even built myself a nice spreadsheet with an algorithm that will calculate how many words each chapter is over the course of the entire novel. All this to say that I then have something that I can look at that tells me what percentage I am through the novel every single day when I upload my word count for that day. That feels good. I just crossed over the 50% threshold like a week ago. I'm recording this on December 4th, by the way. So that feels good. I know that I'm making progress. I don't know if the progress is particularly good, but that's a whole other thing. The first goal is to finish the book. And I can evaluate that I am getting closer to that every single day. Progress is important, not for its own sake necessarily, but because it shows us that we're making headway, that what you're doing, the time you're investing is worthwhile, it is achieving something, and we need that encouragement. Goals and plans not only help you solidify exactly what you want to achieve, but they help you get there and they help you document the fact that you are getting there. it's good for motivation, it's good for productivity, it's good for efficiency, and that's all the time I'm going to spend on that right now. Let's talk about habits. Developing habits in general is a great strategy, but unfortunately, it's kind of like saying the trick to exercising is working out. The biggest thing here is to start very small and hold yourself to very low standards at first. If you lack consistency in your art practice, it isn't something you are going to fix overnight. You are going to have to work on it, and it's going to take some time. I often talk about the importance of drawing every day, even if it's just for a few minutes. The reason is not that you have to draw every day if you want to be a good artist, but that habits are difficult. And if you can get yourself to simply put a utensil onto a page every day, you've already jumped the first hurdle. If you commit to drawing 5 minutes a day and manage to achieve that, it becomes much easier to expand that time. Also, if you are gracious with yourself about missing a day, then you will miss fewer, and you won't stop entirely when you miss several in a row. It prevents you from feeling like a failure. So should you try to draw every day? I think if you have the chance, yes. But it's more likely that your schedule will dictate what you can do. So try to think about what habits will be helpful for you. If you send yourself to a coffee shop where all you're allowed to do is draw once a week, that will ensure that it happens. If you set aside some daily or weekly time with your children to just put on some music and make art together, it ensures that you make time. So take a good look at your schedule. Try to figure out where consistency can infiltrate, and then set it up. And take it seriously. If this is important to you, treat it like you would anything else that is of great importance. For me, it's about as important as making sure I stay in shape or that I eat well. All of it is good for the whole me, because I'm a worse version of me when I don't create. And I am a very habitual person. I tend to do the same things that I tend to do, which of course all of us do, but I think sometimes I tend to lean into it a little bit more heavily. So for me, trying to draw every day, trying to make my videos every week, trying to make sure that I go to the gallery once a week, even though I don't quite have to work that frequently, it means that it's built into my schedule in my mind. It makes it easier for me to engage in. So I would encourage you, start small. Look at what habits you can build given the structure of your life, given the time that you have available, and just take some time and think about what you want and which habits are going to help you get there. At a basic level though, I would try to figure out how many days a week you can draw for 15 minutes or more and block that time out. Schedule it as you can and as you need to. If you get to the end of your day and want to play video games, maybe draw for 15 minutes first and reward yourself with the games afterwards. Build the habits that point you in the direction that you want to go. Lastly, I want to talk about space and supplies. I've actually kind of talked about this a little bit throughout the entirety of the episode, but here at the end, we're going to focus there for a couple minutes. Again, it's very important to have space, to dedicate whatever space you can toward your art practice. But we have to look at this in terms of lowering that barrier to entry. So how can you make your art space, your art supplies work for you? The first thing you can do is make it as easy as possible to engage in your work. And this is probably going to come down to making sure that your space is clean. Now, this doesn't need to be clean in the way that your mom or your spouse are necessarily going to look at it and go, yes, this is a clean space. It means that it's able to be used by you. In my case, I don't need to have my drawing table totally swept around the bottom and clean, nothing on the space. I don't need to have my easel free of things, but I need to make sure that pencils are sharpened. I need to make sure that I don't have any debris laying around. I need to make sure that I clean my palette, which I always seem to forget to do. Those kinds of cleanliness things are important. It means putting your pens and pencils back into whatever storage devices you use for them, so you don't find yourself looking for the exact blue that you need and you just can't find it. Your cleanliness when it comes to your studio space is going to differ based on what your needs are. And it's largely just going to mean setting yourself up for the next session in a way that's hospitable and easy to engage in. This also likely means taking down supplies at the end. If you have elaborate setups for anything that you do, it's going to mean kind of getting it set up again for you to get into the next session. For me, a lot of the time, this is just lighting and reference materials. I might bring my iPad over and use it for references, but then if I don't put it back and I put it on its charger, then it's not available for me next time. These are obviously little things, but again, I have been surprised over my art career, really looking at and thinking about how often the issues arise from tiny little things. So every one of those that you can shave off is like a burr on this giant piece of wood, and it just makes it smoother and smoother. Sometimes it's a really good idea too to set up things for next time. So if you know what you're going to be working on next time, get your reference materials ready, get your pens and pencils ready, get your paper out. I don't often remember to do this with anything other than references, but I sat down 2 days ago to get started on a couple paintings for a local craft show, and it was so nice to already have the reference photos that I wanted to work on. That is often not the case, and I tend to be one of those people that will spend a long time looking for the perfect reference photo, which of course doesn't exist, but I will spend too much time doing it. And so having that amassed ahead of time is a really good thing for me. And all of this just comes down to making sure that your studio space is prepped for your needs. I don't want to spend a ton of time here because the episode's getting long, and also I'm just going to give a lot of examples. But you can look at your studio space, even if it's just that corner of your room, and understand what your needs are. For me, a lot of times it's just putting things back where they go because I get excited and then get pulled into other things and don't put my supplies away. But whatever it is for you, I would encourage you to just start building that habit of working on those things. Consistency is important. Really, with anything that you want to build up in your life, any skill that you want to develop, you're going to have to be consistent with it. And though it's often very hard because we are so excited and we're pulled into things because we get inspired, art consistency is super important. And I hope that this podcast, that this episode in particular, has given you some strategies or maybe even just some solace about why it's a struggle for you. I would love to hear any of your thoughts in the comments below. Specifically, also would like to hear if there's anything that I missed or anything you would like me to elaborate on further. Well, as always, thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. Thank you to my patrons who are on the screen now. And if you want to check out my Patreon, you can do so in the link below. It gives you access to some videos that are not here on YouTube, as well as the ability to vote and push me in directions of content that you want to see. And also, it's just a support for what I do here. So if you appreciate what I do here, that would be a good way to give back if you have the ability. In addition, the Discord server is linked below as well. Have a good one, y'all. See you soon.